Ethan Warren stood in the principal's office, his face red with fury, his arms wrapped protectively around the girl he had always believed to be his white moonlight, Madison G. His voice, sharp as a blade, cut through the tense silence. "Call the police. Check the surveillance footage. This time, I will expose your true face in front of everyone." His words were dramatic, filled with righteous anger, as if he were the hero of some tragic love story. In another life, I would have been crushed by this moment, by the betrayal, by the cold hatred in his eyes. But today? I could barely suppress my smirk. Because this time I knew the truth. This time I was reborn too. I folded my arms, my gaze cool as I leaned against the doorway. "No need to thank me, Ethan. I already called the police on my way here." His expression flickered for a brief second. I knew that look, shock, confusion, maybe even the first trace of fear. Good. Let it settle in. Let him realize that this time, things wouldn't go the way he expected. The principal, a man who usually bent like a reed in front of the powerful Warren family, hesitated. He glanced at Mrs. Warren, Ethan's mother, who sat in silence on the sofa, her presence alone enough to make anyone tread carefully. Ethan turned toward her, expecting her support. But before she could say a word, the office door creaked open. My homeroom teacher stepped in, carefully helping me forward. Gasps rippled through the room as all eyes fell on me. My right arm was wrapped in a cast, suspended high in a sling. The collar of my uniform was torn, exposing the fresh, swollen burns scattered across my skin, marks from a cigarette. My lower lip was split, and bruises blossomed across my cheek. I looked like I had walked out of a battlefield. Ethan froze mid-sentence, his body going rigid. His breath hitched, as if someone had just yanked the air from his lungs. Madison, wrapped in his arms, trembled. Her soaking wet clothes clung to her delicate frame, her mascara smeared across her cheeks as she whimpered pitifully. But no one was looking at her anymore. Mrs. Warren was the first to break the silence. She stepped toward me, her carefully curated elegance slipping into something almost resembling concern. "Olivia, what happened?" I hesitated, my fingers curling slightly, my lips parting like I was unsure if I should speak. I had to play this moment just right. Mrs. Warren's grip tightened around my good hand. "Be honest with me." I lifted my gaze, my expression calm as I pointed directly at Madison. "She dragged me into the restroom," I said, my voice steady. "She had her people block the stairway so no one could pass. She tore my clothes, burned me with a cigarette, and called me." I paused, glancing at the fresh burns. "Well, you can see the evidence yourself." Madison shrieked, her voice high-pitched with panic. "She's lying. Aunt Warren, look at my clothes. They're soaked. She attacked me first." I stayed silent, my eyes drifting to the pocket of her uniform. The fabric, now nearly transparent from being wet, revealed the bright red cigarette pack and lighter nestled inside. Mrs. Warren's expression darkened. Without hesitation, she stepped forward, reached into Madison's pocket, and yanked the items out. The cigarette pack landed on the floor with a crisp, incriminating sound. The room fell deathly silent. "Still want to lie?" Mrs. Warren's voice was like ice. Madison's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. She was trapped, like a rat in a cage. But Ethan was still desperately clinging to his delusion. He turned toward me, his eyes burning with raw hatred. "You set her up, didn't you? You did this to her." I held his gaze, unflinching. "And what exactly did I do, Ethan?" I asked, my voice quiet but cutting. "Did I grab Madison's hand and force her to burn me with a cigarette? Did I make her tear my clothes? Did I make her gather a gang to attack me?" His jaw clenched, his fists trembling at his sides. I could see the cracks forming in his belief, the doubt creeping in, but his pride wouldn't let him accept it. Not yet. But he wasn't the only one with secrets. I had seen that look in his eyes before, the flicker of familiarity, the way his anger was laced with something deeper. He was reborn too. Perfect. A slow, satisfied smile curled up my lips. Justice should be served to the right person. And Ethan? He had a lifetime of sins to repay. A knock sounded at the door, breaking the heavy silence. Right on time, I murmured. Then, with a sharp glance toward Ethan and Madison, I strode forward and pulled the door open. The police had arrived. And this time I was ready to watch them fall. Ethan stood frozen, his body stiff, his breath caught in his throat as the police officers stepped inside. The room, once thick with tension, now bristled with a different kind of energy, one of looming judgment. Madison whimpered, clutching onto him, but even in her panic, she knew she was slipping from control. I stayed silent, my face unreadable, my mind racing. Justice was here, and I was going to enjoy every second of it. One of the officers, a tall man with sharp, assessing eyes, stepped forward. We received a report about an assault. We need both parties involved to come with us for questioning. Madison let out a strangled sob, her head whipping toward Mrs. Warren. Auntie, you have to help me. They're making a mistake. Mrs. Warren didn't react immediately. Her perfectly manicured nails tapped lightly against the armrest of her chair, her usual composed expression shifting ever so slightly. For the first time, I saw something crack in her mask, hesitation. She had always been a woman who valued control. And yet, this situation? It was slipping beyond even her grasp. I believe this is unnecessary, she finally said, her voice smooth, polished. This is an internal school matter. There's no need to involve the authorities. The officer remained unimpressed. The victim called us, ma'am. A report has already been filed. He turned his gaze to me. Miss Olivia, you will need to come with us as well. We need to hear your statement. I nodded. Of course. I turned to Madison, my expression neutral, though a quiet satisfaction hummed beneath my skin. Shall we? Madison's face twisted with fear and rage. But what could she do? She was caught, and she knew it. Ethan, however, was still clinging to his delusions. This is insane. Olivia is the one who's lying. She set Madison up. He turned his desperate eyes to the officers. You have to check the footage. You'll see. The officer didn't flinch. We've already pulled the surveillance footage. A sharp inhale cut through the room. Ethan paled. The officer continued. We have clear evidence that Madison was the one who initiated the attack. We also have testimonies from other students who witnessed similar incidents in the past. His gaze hardened. This is not an isolated event. Silence. A cold, heavy silence. Madison visibly shrank, her lips trembling. Ethan opened his mouth, but no words came out. I exhaled slowly, watching them with detached amusement. It was fascinating, really. The way the truth had a way of dismantling even the most well-constructed lies. Mrs. Warren finally stood, smoothing the front of her dress as if trying to maintain some semblance of authority. I will have my lawyer look into this. The officer merely shrugged. That's your right. And with that, they escorted Madison out, her cries of protest growing weaker with each step. Ethan stood, rooted to the spot, his expression unreadable. I walked past him, pausing just long enough to whisper, this is only the beginning. His hands clenched into fists, his jaw tightening, but he said nothing. Perfect. The ride to the police station was quiet. Madison was no longer screaming. She was hunched over, her face buried in her hands. Fear clung to her like a second skin. Good. I had endured years of torment because of her. The scars on my body, the trauma she had inflicted, the loneliness I had been forced to swallow, it was all because of her. And in my past life, I had never fought back. But this life was different. This time, she was going to feel what it was like to be powerless. The questioning was straightforward. I told them everything, how Madison had bullied me, how she had gathered people to torment me, how she had burned me with her cigarette. I showed them my injuries. I gave them names of witnesses. The officers took notes, nodding along. I could tell they believed me. When Madison was brought in, her voice was smaller than before. I didn't do anything, she whimpered. She's lying. She's trying to ruin me. But the evidence was against her. The surveillance footage. The testimonies. The cigarette pack in her pocket. The walls were closing in on her. When the session ended, I walked out with my head held high. Madison, on the other hand, was still shaking. Ethan was waiting outside. His eyes locked onto me the moment I stepped into the hallway. He looked lost. Broken. I stopped a few feet away from him, tilting my head slightly. Do you believe me now? He exhaled sharply, his hands running through his hair. I don't know what to think. I chuckled, shaking my head. That's your problem, Ethan. You never knew what to think. I turned to leave, but his voice stopped me. Olivia. I glanced over my shoulder. What? His jaw tightened. You really called the police on her? I arched a brow. Of course. Why wouldn't I? For a second, just a fleeting second, regret flickered in his eyes. But it was too late for regrets now. I walked away, leaving him standing in the hallway, alone with his doubts. Because the fall of the Warren family had only just begun. Ethan stood in the middle of his family's lavish estate, his hands curled into fists at his sides. The grand chandelier above cast a golden hue on the ornate furniture, but for the first time, the home he had always found comforting felt suffocating. His mind was a battlefield. For years, he had believed that Madison was the innocent one, that Olivia was the schemer, the bully, the manipulator. Yet, what he had seen today, the evidence, the bruises, the sheer weight of the truth, shook his foundations. Had he been wrong all along? Madison sat on the couch across from him, her face still streaked with tears. She looked nothing like the confident, untouchable girl he had grown up with. Her nails dug into her palms, her body trembling. Aunt Warren will fix this, she murmured, her voice hoarse. She'll make this go away. Ethan frowned. For the first time, the idea of his mother sweeping something under the rug made his stomach turn. Did you do it, Madison? She jolted as if he had struck her. What? Did you hurt Olivia? Did you burn her with a cigarette? Her lips parted, but no words came. She opened her mouth again, searching for a response, but all that came out was a shaky exhale. Ethan's heart sank. The silence was more damning than any confession. Ethan, she finally whispered, her voice fragile. You have to believe me. Olivia set me up. She's always wanted to ruin me, she's jealous. Jealous. That was always Madison's excuse, wasn't it? But why would Olivia, the girl who had never sought power, never even fought back before, suddenly orchestrate an elaborate scheme just to take Madison down? His fingers dug into his scalp. I don't know what to think anymore. Madison reached out for him, but he recoiled. She gasped softly, her lower lip trembling. You're my brother, she whispered, her voice desperate. You promised you'd always protect me. Ethan's stomach twisted. Protect her. He had always thought he was doing just that. But what if all this time, he had been protecting the wrong person? Meanwhile, at the Warren family estate, Mrs. Warren sat in her office, her fingers drumming against her desk. The room was dimly lit, the scent of expensive candles heavy in the air. She stared at the documents in front of her, legal paperwork regarding Madison's case. She had fixed countless problems for Madison before. Expunged records, paid off victims, insured incidents were buried. But this? This was different. This time, the evidence was overwhelming. This time, Madison had gone too far. The call from the school had been a disaster. The principal, who once turned a blind eye in exchange for generous donations, had expressed his disapproval. Olivia was a top student, the pride of the school. Having Madison's crimes exposed publicly put them in an impossible position. More than that, Ethan had started asking questions. She exhaled sharply. Ethan had always been the obedient son, trusting, devoted. But now? She could see the doubts creeping into his eyes, the hesitation in his words. He was slipping away from her control. And that was unacceptable. Mrs. Warren picked up her phone and dialed a number. A gruff voice answered on the third ring. "I need you to do something for me." At school, Olivia returned to class, her arm still in a cast, her bruises still healing. Yet, she walked with an air of quiet confidence, an undeniable presence that hadn't been there before. She wasn't the same girl they used to pick on. And the students knew it. She took her seat, ignoring the hushed whispers. Madison's empty chair was a glaring reminder of the shift in power. Even her closest friends, the ones who had once laughed at Olivia's suffering, now avoided her gaze. Olivia smirked. It was about time they learned who they were dealing with. "Hey," her desk mate whispered, leaning over. "You might want to be careful. Word is that Mrs. Warren is trying to pull some strings." Olivia tapped her fingers against her notebook, unfazed. "Let her try." The girl shivered. "You're seriously not afraid of her?" "I've already lost everything before." Olivia's eyes darkened, memories of her past life flashing in her mind. "This time I have nothing to lose." Her desk mate swallowed hard and nodded, choosing not to push further. A few seats away, one of Madison's former lackeys shifted uncomfortably, stealing glances at Olivia. The girl hesitated before finally standing and making her way over. "Olivia." Olivia looked up, eyebrow raised. I just wanted to say. I'm sorry." The girl wrung her hands together, clearly nervous. "I should have stopped her. I should have spoken up." Olivia tilted her head, studying her. "Why now?" she asked. The girl hesitated, then sighed. "Because I know what's coming. Mrs. Warren is going to try and ruin you." Olivia smiled slightly. "Let her try." The girl blinked in surprise. "You really think you can beat her?" Olivia leaned forward, her voice a quiet promise. "I don't think," she said. "I know." And this time, Mrs. Warren was going to learn what it felt like to lose. Ethan sat alone in his car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. His world, once clear and straightforward, now felt like shifting sand beneath his feet. He had always believed he was the hero, the one protecting Madison, the one standing for what was right. But the cracks in that belief had begun to form. And with every passing second, they widened. His mind replayed the surveillance footage over and over. Madison, cigarette in hand, pressing it against Olivia's skin. Madison, smirking as Olivia flinched in pain. Madison, blocking Olivia's escape, her words sharp, cruel, unforgiving. He had defended that girl. He had worshipped her. And now he had to face the reality: Madison wasn't who he thought she was. A sudden knock on the car window made him jump. He turned to see a familiar figure standing outside. Sean. Ethan hesitated before rolling down the window. Sean leaned down, resting an arm against the car. "You look like hell," Sean said bluntly. Ethan exhaled. "Yeah. I feel like it too." Sean studied him for a moment. Then, to Ethan's surprise, he chuckled. "You finally get it, don't you?" Ethan frowned. "Get what?" "That Olivia was never the villain in your story," Sean said. His tone wasn't mocking, just matter of fact. "That you spent your whole life protecting a monster." Ethan's chest tightened. He wanted to argue, wanted to deny it, but the words wouldn't come. Because he knew Sean was right. Sean straightened, slipping his hands into his pockets. "You've got a choice, Ethan. Keep living in denial, or start making things right." Ethan swallowed hard. "And if I want to make things right?" Sean's expression darkened. "Then you better move fast. Because Mrs. Warren isn't going to let Olivia walk away from this unscathed. Ethan's heart pounded. Of course. His mother. At the Warren estate, Mrs. Warren sat in her private study, her fingers tapping rhythmically against the oak desk. The dim lighting cast long shadows across the room, accentuating the sharpness of her gaze. Before her stood a man in a dark suit, his posture rigid, his presence cold. She needs to disappear, she said, her voice devoid of emotion. I don't care how. Olivia has overstayed her welcome. The man nodded. Consider it done. Just as he turned to leave, the door burst open. Ethan. His face was flushed, his breath uneven, but his eyes burned with an intensity Mrs. Warren had never seen before. Don't touch her, he said, his voice low, dangerous. Mrs. Warren barely spared him a glance. You're too emotional right now, Ethan. You don't know what you're saying. I know exactly what I'm saying, he shot back. I've spent my entire life believing whatever you told me. Following your orders. But I won't let you ruin Olivia. Mrs. Warren's lips curled into a slow smile. And what exactly do you plan to do about it? Ethan stepped forward. I'll do whatever it takes. For the first time in his life, he wasn't going to be his mother's pawn. Mrs. Warren studied him for a long moment before leaning back in her chair. Fine, she said. But know this, if you're not on my side, then you are my enemy. Ethan didn't flinch. Then I guess I'm your enemy. He turned on his heel and walked out, his pulse hammering, his mind racing. Because for the first time, he was ready to fight. Meanwhile, Olivia sat at her small desk, flipping through a book with practiced indifference. She had felt Ethan's stare on her all day, but she had long since stopped caring. At least, that's what she told herself. Madison had been released on bail, thanks to Mrs. Warren's connections. But Olivia knew better than to relax. Mrs. Warren wouldn't stop until she had crushed her completely. A small note slipped onto her desk, disrupting her thoughts. She frowned and unfolded it. Meet me on the rooftop after class. No signature. No explanation. But Olivia didn't need one. She knew exactly who had written it. Ethan. She sighed, glancing out the window. The war had officially begun. And she was ready for it. The rooftop was eerily silent when Olivia stepped onto it. The sky was tinged with hues of crimson and gold, the last remnants of sunlight fading into the horizon. The cool evening breeze brushed against her skin as she narrowed her eyes at the lone figure standing at the edge, waiting for her. Ethan. She wasn't sure why she had come. Curiosity? Perhaps. But she had long since learned that listening to Ethan Warren had never done her any good. Still, she had to admit, this time, there was something different about him. I was afraid you wouldn't come, he said, turning around. His voice lacked its usual arrogance, his expression more exhausted than overbearing. Olivia folded her arms. Say what you need to say and make it quick. Ethan hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck. He looked uncomfortable, as if he was grappling with something he wasn't sure he could put into words. Finally, he spoke. I was wrong. Olivia arched a brow. About what? Be specific. Ethan let out a breath, shoulders sagging. About everything. About Madison. About you. About all the years I spent believing lies. Olivia watched him carefully. She had dreamed of hearing those words before. In another life, she had begged for them. She had pleaded for Ethan to see the truth, to recognize her suffering. But now? It was too late for regrets. Do you think that changes anything? She asked, voice sharp as steel. That an apology wipes away the years of torment? That it erases the way you let her destroy me? Ethan shook his head. No. I don't expect forgiveness. I can't keep pretending I don't see what's right in front of me. Olivia scoffed. Then what do you want, Ethan? He stepped closer, his blue eyes burning with something intense. I want to help you. Olivia blinked, stunned into silence. Help her? She had spent years fighting alone, crawling through the wreckage Madison and Mrs. Warren had left behind. And now, Ethan, her greatest betrayer, was offering his aid? A bitter laugh bubbled in her throat. You think I need your help? Ethan didn't waver. You don't. But Mrs. Warren won't stop. She's already making moves, Olivia. You think she'll just let you walk away from this? She'll ruin you. I'm not afraid of her. You should be, Ethan said, his jaw clenching. She's not just coming after your reputation anymore. She wants you gone. Olivia's heart skipped a beat. She had anticipated retaliation. Had braced herself for whispers, for sabotaged opportunities, for relentless persecution. But this? Ethan took another step forward. I know how she operates. I know the people she hires. Olivia, if you don't fight back, you won't survive. For the first time since her rebirth, real fear flickered in Olivia's chest. Not for herself, but for the people who had stood by her. Sean, the teachers who had defended her, the few friends she had left. They would be targets too. Ethan read the turmoil in her eyes. Let me help, he repeated, quieter this time. Not because I deserve your trust, but because you need someone who knows exactly what she's capable of. Olivia was silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, she exhaled. If you betray me again, Ethan, she murmured, eyes dark. I will make you regret it. Ethan nodded. I know. And just like that, the lines had been redrawn. Mrs. Warren sat in her dimly lit office, a single glass of wine in her hand. The weight of the situation pressed down on her, but she didn't waver. Madison sat in the corner, pale and withdrawn, her fingers digging into her arms. You're losing control, Madison whispered, her voice raw. Ethan is slipping away. Olivia is winning. Mrs. Warren took a slow sip, unfazed. No, my dear. Olivia may have gained some traction, but this is far from over. Madison's eyes darted up, desperate. Then do something. Fix this. Mrs. Warren placed her glass down, the sound echoing in the silence. I already have. Madison stiffened. What do you mean? Mrs. Warren's lips curled into a cold smile. By tomorrow morning, Olivia won't have a future to fight for. The next day, Olivia walked into school, her head held high despite the tension that hung in the air. Whispers followed her. But these weren't the usual murmurs about Madison's downfall. These were different. She's disgusting. How could she do something like that? I always knew she was trouble. Olivia frowned, her steps slowing as she noticed the way people were looking at her. Judging. Sneering. A sick feeling settled in her gut. Then, she saw it. A giant printed photograph had been pinned to the school's bulletin board, right in the center of the hallway. Her. In a hotel room. With an older man. The image was grainy, clearly edited, but it didn't matter. Perception was reality. And Mrs. Warren had just fired her first real shot. Olivia's stomach twisted as she turned on her heel and stormed away. She needed to find Ethan. Because the war had truly begun. Olivia's pulse pounded in her ears as she stormed down the hall, her fists clenched. The whispers grew louder, feeding off the scandal like vultures circling a fresh carcass. She could feel the stares, the judgment, the barely contained laughter. She refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. Instead, she kept walking, straight to the one person who could give her answers. Ethan. She found him in the empty science lab, staring at his phone. His brows were furrowed, his jaw tight. The moment he saw her, his grip on the device loosened slightly, but his expression didn't change. You saw it, she said, her voice sharp. Ethan nodded, exhaling through his nose. I was expecting something, but this, he ran a hand through his hair, shaking his head. They didn't waste time. They? Olivia folded her arms. Who's behind it? Ethan hesitated, but then he met her gaze with something she hadn't seen in a long time, determination. My mother. Olivia clenched her teeth. She had known it. Mrs. Warren was too powerful, too resourceful. The fabricated scandal had her fingerprints all over it. I need to prove it's fake, Olivia said, her voice low but steady. And I need to do it fast. Ethan nodded, already pulling up his contacts. I have someone who can trace the image back to its source. If we can find the original, we can expose the forgery. Olivia arched a brow. And you expect me to trust you with this? Ethan flinched, but didn't back down. I expect you to trust that I want to destroy her just as much as you do. Silence stretched between them. Then, slowly, Olivia nodded. Fine. But if you screw this up, I won't. Across town, Mrs. Warren sat in her office, watching as the scandal spread like wildfire across social media. She sipped her tea, satisfied. The narrative had been set. Olivia was nothing more than an opportunist, a girl who had used her beauty and intelligence to manipulate powerful men. Madison, she called, not bothering to look up from her phone. Madison entered hesitantly, still shaken from recent events. Yes? Mrs. Warren finally met her gaze. The trap is set. All you need to do is make sure Olivia reacts emotionally. If she loses control, everything will fall into place. Madison nodded quickly, but there was unease in her eyes. And if she finds proof it's fake? Mrs. Warren smirked. Then we ensure that proof never sees the light of day. Hours later, Olivia sat in the back of an internet cafe with Sean, who was furiously typing on his laptop. His eyes flicked between lines of code, tracing the digital breadcrumbs that led back to the fabricated image. There, he said, pointing to the screen. It was uploaded from a private server 2 days ago. And guess who the registered owner is? Olivia's stomach twisted as she read the name. Madison G. Of course. We can use this, Ethan said from beside her. If we present this to the school board, to the police, not yet, Olivia interrupted, her mind racing. If we move too soon, Mrs. Warren will just cover her tracks. We need more. Sean raised a brow. More? A slow, cold smile spread across Olivia's lips. We need to set our own trap. The next day, Olivia made sure to walk into school with her head held high. If they wanted to paint her as the villain, she would let them. But villains didn't crumble under pressure. They fought back. And soon, the Warren family would realize they had underestimated her. Because Olivia wasn't just going to prove her innocence. She was going to make them regret ever coming after her. The school hallways were still thick with whispers when Olivia arrived the next morning. The scandal had spread far beyond the school grounds, making its way onto social media and even local news blogs. Students, teachers, and even parents had begun speculating about her so-called secret life. She ignored the pointed stares, the hushed murmurs, and the condescending looks. They had all been so quick to believe a lie. But they would soon learn the truth. Ethan and Sean were already waiting for her in an empty classroom. Sean's fingers flew across his laptop keyboard while Ethan paced near the window, his jaw set in frustration. I traced the photo's origin again, Sean said, not looking up. Madison might have been the one who uploaded it, but she's not smart enough to create something this convincing. Someone with serious expertise edited that image. Olivia exhaled, leaning against the desk. Which means Mrs. Warren is behind it. No doubt, Ethan muttered. He stopped pacing and looked at her. We need to go public. We have proof. Let's expose them now before they bury it. Olivia shook her head. Not yet. Ethan frowned. Why not? Because if we expose them now, Mrs. Warren will play the victim, Olivia explained, crossing her arms. She'll say I'm attacking her family, making excuses for my own behavior. She'll twist it into something worse. Sean nodded. She's right. We need something bigger. Something that makes it impossible for her to worm her way out. Ethan clenched his jaw, clearly frustrated but relented. So, what's the plan? Olivia smirked. We turn their game against them. Madison was already gloating when Olivia walked into the cafeteria at lunchtime. She was surrounded by a group of students, laughing loudly, her voice just loud enough for Olivia to hear. She probably cried herself to sleep last night, Madison sneered, flicking her hair over her shoulder. I mean, imagine being caught in such an embarrassing scandal. The students around her laughed, nodding in agreement. Olivia could feel their eyes shifting between her and Madison, eager to see what would happen next. Perfect. She strode forward, purpose in every step, stopping just short of Madison's table. The entire cafeteria fell silent. Madison blinked up at her, feigning innocence. Oh, Olivia. You look terrible. I guess being exposed as a homewrecker does that to a person. Olivia smirked. I'd be careful with those words, Madison. You never know when they might come back to haunt you. Madison scoffed. Oh? And what exactly do you think you're going to do? Olivia reached into her bag and pulled out her phone, holding it up. I just thought you'd like to know that I have proof the image was faked. Madison's smirk faltered. That's a lie. Is it? Olivia tapped the screen, playing the recording Sean had prepared earlier. The distorted voice of a digital investigator explained how the metadata had been altered, how the pixels had been manipulated. The cafeteria was dead silent as the audio played. When it ended, Olivia looked directly at Madison. Care to explain why your login credentials were found on the site that uploaded the image? Madison's face went pale. She choked. You're making that up. Olivia tilted her head. You seem nervous. Maybe you should call Mrs. Warren and ask her what to do next. Madison shot up from her seat, knocking over her tray. The murmurs around the cafeteria had changed. Suspicion replaced mockery. Students exchanged glances, whispering behind their hands. Madison's plan was unraveling right before her eyes. Olivia took a step closer, lowering her voice just enough for only Madison to hear. Checkmate. Madison's hands trembled. She turned and bolted from the cafeteria. Ethan appeared at Olivia's side, watching Madison disappear. That was risky. Olivia shrugged. Not really. She's predictable. Sean walked up, grinning. And now she'll run straight to Mrs. Warren. Just like we planned. Ethan looked at them both. What happens next? Olivia's smirk returned. Now? We let them make their final mistake. Because soon, it wouldn't just be Madison's downfall. It would be Mrs. Warren's too. The Warren estate was silent when Madison burst into her mother's office, her face pale, her breath uneven. Mrs. Warren looked up from her desk, her eyes narrowing at the sight of her daughter in such a state. What happened? She asked, already irritated. Madison swallowed, gripping the edge of the desk. Olivia. She is proof that I faked the scandal. Mrs. Warren's gaze turned cold. What do you mean, proof? Madison exhaled shakily. She has everything. The digital traces, the login credentials. She played me, Mom. She knew this was coming. For the first time in years, Mrs. Warren's composure slipped. A tiny crease formed between her brows as she leaned back in her chair. And what did you do? Madison clenched her fists. I ran. Mrs. Warren's jaw tensed, and she let out a slow, measured breath. That was your first mistake. Madison's breath hitched. You can fix this, right? Mrs. Warren tapped her manicured fingers on the desk. I always fix things, Madison. But this time, her voice trailed off as her sharp mind began calculating their next move. Then the phone rang. Mrs. Warren picked it up without breaking eye contact with her daughter. Yes? A pause. Then, the color drained from her face. When? Another pause. I see. Handle it. She hung up, standing abruptly. Madison flinched at the sudden movement. What is it? She asked. Mrs. Warren grabbed her coat, her voice clipped. Ethan. Madison's eyes widened. What about him? He's turned on us. Ethan stood outside Olivia's apartment, his fingers hovering over the doorbell. He had made his choice, but that didn't make it any easier. Before he could ring, the door swung open. Olivia stood there, arms crossed. Took you long enough. Ethan let out a dry chuckle. Didn't think you'd be happy to see me. I'm not, Olivia said. But I need to know if you're serious about this. Ethan met her gaze. I am. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Olivia stepped aside. Come in. Ethan followed her inside, noting Sean and a few others gathered around a laptop. Sean looked up and raised an eyebrow. You finally grew a spine? Ethan sighed. Yeah. Let's just get to it. Sean smirked and turned the laptop toward him. Good. Because we just got something big. Ethan's eyes widened as he took in the information on the screen. You're kidding. Olivia shook her head. Nope. And it's enough to take her down for good. Ethan exhaled. Then let's end this. Mrs. Warren entered her office with a measured pace, her hands tightening around the arms of her chair as she sat down. Madison hovered near the door, unsure of what to do. Then the intercom buzzed. Mrs. Warren, her assistant's voice crackled through. There's something you need to see. Mrs. Warren frowned. What is it? Check the news. She grabbed her remote and turned on the television. A news anchor appeared on screen, her voice steady but laced with curiosity. In breaking news, a scandal involving a fabricated image has been linked directly to the Warren family. Madison sucked in a sharp breath. No, Mrs. Warren remained silent, her nails digging into the leather of her chair as the screen cut to a press conference, featuring Olivia, Sean, and, to her growing horror, Ethan. Her own son. Ethan cleared his throat and stepped forward. For years, my mother has operated under the assumption that she is untouchable. That she can manipulate the truth and ruin anyone who stands in her way. But today, that ends. The cameras flashed as reporters rushed forward, shouting questions. Olivia raised her hand, silencing them. We have undeniable evidence that Mrs. Warren was behind the attempt to destroy my reputation, Olivia continued. She orchestrated the entire scandal, using her daughter Madison as the primary pawn. Madison collapsed into a chair, her face in her hands. We're ruined. Mrs. Warren stared at the screen, her mind spinning through possible escape routes, ways to contain the damage. But she knew. This time, she had lost. Ethan exhaled as the press conference ended. He looked at Olivia, something unreadable in his expression. It's done. Olivia nodded. Almost. Ethan frowned. Almost? Olivia smirked. Mrs. Warren won't go down quietly. But now? She has no cards left to play. Ethan let out a breath, something between relief and exhaustion washing over him. So, what now? Olivia turned to him, her eyes gleaming. Now? We watch her fall.